My name is Caroline Marsh and I have been a high school English teacher for 16 years. I have spent my entire career teaching young people how to read between the lines, how to find the meaning underneath the surface of things, how to ask the right questions about the stories in front of them. It is deeply ironic then that for 12 years I was living inside a story I never thought to question. A story my husband had written carefully and quietly right underneath my nose while I was busy trusting him completely. The morning I found out started like every other morning. Coffee at 6:30. Shower. The sound of Marcus getting ready in the next room. He kissed me on the cheek before he left for work and told me he would be home by 7. I stood at the kitchen counter in a house we had built together over 12 years, and I felt the particular quiet contentment of a woman who believes her life is exactly what it appears to be. I was wrong about almost everything that morning and I had no idea at all. It started with a piece of mail that was not addressed to me. It arrived in our mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in March addressed to Marcus D. Harlow at our home address but from a financial institution I had never heard of. Harlow was Marcus's mother's maiden name. He had never used it for anything in the 12 years I had known him. I stood at the mailbox holding the envelope for a long time before I brought it inside and set it on the counter and stared at it while I made dinner and told myself it was probably nothing and tried to believe that. I did not open it that night. I told myself it was because I respected his privacy. The more honest answer is that I was afraid of what might be inside. I had been a good student of literature my entire life and I understood on some level that the moment you open the envelope that changes everything is the moment you can no longer go back to not knowing. I was not ready to not be able to go back. So I left it on the counter and went to bed and lay awake for most of the night anyway. Marcus came home at 7 as promised. He saw the envelope immediately. Something moved across his face so quickly I almost missed it and then it was gone and he picked it up and said it was probably junk mail from a bank trying to solicit new accounts and put it in his jacket pocket and asked me what was for dinner. His voice was completely steady. His hands were completely steady. He had the ease of a man who had spent years becoming comfortable with this particular kind of moment and I sat across from him at dinner and watched him eat and felt something cold moving very slowly through my chest that I could not yet name. Before I tell you what I found, I want to tell you something about the kind of marriage Marcus and I had on the surface because I think it matters for understanding how something like this can exist undetected for so long. We were not a couple who fought constantly or lived in obvious tension or gave the people around us any particular reason to worry. We were the couple that other couples complimented. We finished each other's sentences. We had the same sense of humor. We made decisions together about the house and Sophie's school, and where to spend the holidays and which car to replace first, and every visible dimension of our shared life was genuinely collaborative. People who knew us well would have described us as solid, as a team, as one of those marriages that looks like it actually works. That description was accurate about almost everything except the one thing that turned out to matter most. I need to tell you about Marcus before I tell you what I found. He was not a villain in the obvious way. He was not cold or distant or cruel. He was warm and funny and the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries and learned to cook the specific pasta dish I loved, and always knew when I needed quiet versus when I needed company. He was a good father to our daughter Sophie, who was 9 years old, and adored him. He coached her soccer team on Saturday mornings and helped her with homework on weeknights, and the way he looked at her was genuinely tender in a way I never had any reason to doubt. He worked in financial consulting. He had worked in financial consulting since before I met him. He managed portfolios for mid-sized businesses and he was good at his work and his income was solid and consistent, and I trusted him completely with our finances because he understood them in ways I did not, and because trusting each other was what we did. That trust was not naive. It was built over 12 years of a shared life that felt real and stable and good. It simply turned out that the stability I had been trusting was built on a foundation I had never been permitted to see. 3 days after the envelope arrived, I searched his name in combination with the name of the financial institution on the return address. The results were limited because the institution was small and regional. But I found enough to understand that it was a legitimate private banking service, used primarily for personal wealth management. Not for business accounts, for personal ones. I sat at my laptop in our kitchen while Marcus was at Sophie's soccer practice, and I felt the cold thing in my chest become something sharper and more specific. I called my friend Renata that evening. She was a certified financial planner and one of the most direct people I had ever known. I told her what I had found and what I suspected, and she listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. And then she told me very calmly that I needed to find out the full picture of our household finances before I said anything to Marcus. She said I needed to gather information, not accusations, and she offered to help me understand what I was looking at if I could get access to documents. Over the next 2 weeks, I began carefully reviewing every financial record I could access. I had always trusted Marcus to manage our accounts, and so I had never paid particularly close attention to the details. Our joint checking account, our joint savings, the mortgage statements, the investment accounts we had opened together early in our marriage. What I found when I actually looked was not evidence of anything wrong on its own. The numbers added up. The balances were reasonable. Nothing was obviously missing. But something was bothering me that I could not identify precisely until Renata pointed it out. Given our combined income over 12 years, we should have had significantly more in savings than we did. Marcus earned well. I earned steadily. We lived comfortably but not extravagantly. We had one modest vacation per year. We drove reasonable cars. We did not spend beyond our means in any way I could point to. And yet our joint savings reflected 12 years of a couple who had saved far less than two people with our income should reasonably have accumulated. Renata looked at the numbers I shared with her and was quiet for a moment. Then she told me that the gap between what we should have and what we had was significant enough to warrant serious investigation. She estimated conservatively that somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000 was unaccounted for across the span of our marriage. She said it quietly and carefully, the way people do when they are telling you something that is going to rearrange the way you understand your entire life. I sat with that number for 3 days before I did anything about it. I went to work. I taught my students about subtext and narrative tension, and the difference between what a story says on the surface and what it actually means. I came home and cooked dinner and helped Sophie with her homework and watched Marcus move through our house with the easy confidence of a man who had no idea his wife was standing in the middle of his carefully constructed story and finally reading it correctly. On the 4th day, I contacted a private attorney. Her name was Janet Okafor, and she specialized in marital financial disputes. I told her everything from the beginning. The envelope, the name Harlow, the savings gap, Renata's assessment. Janet listened with the focused attention of someone who had heard versions of this story before, and she told me that what I needed was a forensic financial audit of our marital assets, and that she could arrange one through a professional who could work discreetly. She told me not to confront Marcus until the audit was complete, because the moment he knew I was looking, he might move funds in ways that would make recovery significantly harder. I agreed to wait. Waiting was the hardest thing I had done in a very long time. I sat across from Marcus at dinner every evening for 3 weeks while the auditor worked, and I watched him talk about his day and help Sophie with geography homework and refill my coffee without being asked, and I thought about the envelope and the name Harlow and the gap between the life I thought we had and whatever the actual truth turned out to be. The audit results came on a Friday afternoon, while I was between classes. Janet called me and spoke for 11 minutes. I stood in the empty hallway outside my classroom and listened to her explain what the auditor had found. Marcus had maintained a private account under his mother's maiden name for at minimum 9 years. The account held $342,000. The deposits into that account corresponded precisely with small consistent withdrawals from our joint accounts over the same period. Not large withdrawals. Never anything that would appear alarming in a single month. But steady and deliberate across 9 years, they added up to exactly what was missing from the life we were supposed to be building together. Every dollar in that account had come from money we had both earned and both contributed to our shared finances. He had not taken it from his personal income. He had taken it from ours. From the account we had opened together when we were 28 years old and newly married, and making promises about the future we were going to build. He had been quietly and methodically moving our shared money into a private account under a name I had never associated with him for nearly a decade. And I had trusted him so completely that I had never once looked closely enough to see it. Janet told me I had several options, and she outlined each one carefully. I could confront Marcus directly and negotiate privately. I could initiate divorce proceedings immediately and use the audit as evidence of financial misconduct. I could pursue the funds as marital assets in court, given that they had been accumulated from joint income. She told me that under the laws of our state I had a strong claim to at minimum half of the account regardless of the name it was held under because the source of the funds was demonstrably our joint income. I went home that evening and made dinner and helped Sophie finish a school project about ecosystems, and watched Marcus pour himself a glass of wine and ask me about my day, and I thought about everything Janet had told me and I made a decision that surprised even me a little. I was not going to do this quietly. Not because I wanted drama, but because Marcus had spent 9 years being quiet in ways that had cost me something real, and I was not going to match his silence with mine. I waited until Sophie was in bed. Then I sat down across from Marcus at the kitchen table, and I told him that I knew about the account. I did not say Harlow. I did not need to. The way his face changed in the 2 seconds after I said those words told me everything I had not yet been told directly. He looked like a man who had spent 9 years moving carefully through a house in the dark and had just heard the light. Come on. He tried several approaches in the conversation that followed. He said the account was meant to be a surprise for our retirement. He said he had been planning to tell me. He said he had set it aside because he was worried about financial security and had not known how to explain the reasoning without seeming like he did not trust me. Each explanation arrived with the quality of something retrieved from a mental list of options rather than something genuine rising up from a person who was actually telling the truth. I had spent 16 years teaching students to recognize the difference between authentic voice and performed voice in writing, and I recognized it now with painful clarity. I told him I had already spoken to an attorney. His face changed again in a different way. The quality of the conversation shifted entirely at that point. He stopped offering explanations and became quiet, and then after a long moment he said he was sorry in a voice that sounded more like a person who had been caught than a person who genuinely understood what they had done. I told him I believed he was sorry, and that it did not change what I needed to do next. The divorce process took 8 months. Marcus retained his own attorney, and the early weeks involved the kind of negotiation that is exhausting in a very specific way when it is happening across a kitchen table with someone you once loved without reservation. But Janet was thorough and the audit was thorough and the documentation of the account and its funding sources was thorough, and in the end the settlement reflected that thoroughness in ways that protected Sophie's future and mine. I kept the house. I received my portion of the account which Janet negotiated as my full legal share given the circumstances. Marcus moved into an apartment across town and continued to be a present father to Sophie, which I was genuinely grateful for because whatever he had done to our marriage, he had not done to his relationship with her, and I did not want her to lose that. I went back to work and taught my classes and continued teaching my students about the importance of reading carefully and asking the right questions and not accepting the surface of things as the whole story. The irony of that was not lost on me. But I found that teaching those things after living them felt different than teaching them before. More grounded. More honest. Like I was speaking from somewhere real rather than somewhere theoretical. What I want to say to you at the end of this story is something simple. Financial trust in a marriage is a form of intimacy, and it deserves the same attention and honesty as every other form of intimacy. You do not have to be an accountant or a financial expert to ask questions about where your shared money goes. You are allowed to look. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to understand the full picture of the life you are building with another person. That is not distrust. That is partnership. Real partnership does not require one person to remain uninformed in order to function. My name is Caroline Marsh. I have been a teacher for 16 years. I spent 12 years inside a story I never thought to read carefully enough. When I finally did, I found the truth exactly where it had always been. Waiting patiently for someone to look directly at it. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me your story, because I know I am not the only one who trusted someone completely and discovered that trust had been used as a door, rather than a foundation. Take care of yourselves. There is something I have thought about many times since the settlement was finalized, and I want to say it here because I think it is important. I have wondered whether Marcus had a plan for the money. Whether there was an exit strategy attached to that account that I never discovered. Whether the 9 years of quiet accumulation was building towards something specific that I interrupted by finding the envelope on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I asked Janet about this once and she said it was possible but ultimately unknowable, and that the more useful question was not what he intended to do with it but what I intended to do with my portion of it now that it was legally mine. I thought about that for a long time. I had spent 12 years contributing to a shared future that had been quietly redirected without my knowledge. The money that came back to me in the settlement was not just money. It was 12 years of work and trust and the particular kind of faith that people bring to a life they are building with someone they love. I decided to put a portion of it into a college fund for Sophie, because her future had always been the thing both Marcus and I agreed on regardless of everything else. I put another portion into my own retirement account that was entirely in my name. Not because I planned to hide it from anyone, but because I had learned something real about the difference between shared and mine, and I wanted to understand that difference clearly going forward. The rest I kept liquid for a year while I figured out what I actually wanted. That was a new experience for me. Sitting with resources and asking myself what I actually wanted rather than what made sense for us. It took longer than I expected to even know how to ask that question properly. But I got there eventually. I also want to say something about Sophie because she deserves to be acknowledged in this story even though she was not the center of it. She was 9 years old when her father moved out. She asked me once why he did not live with us anymore, and I told her the truth in the way you tell truth to a 9-year-old, which is to say I told her a version of it that was honest without being more than she needed to carry. I told her that her father and I had made some decisions that were not working for both of us anymore, and that those decisions were between us and had nothing to do with how much either of us loved her. She accepted that with the particular trust that children have in the people who have always been honest with them, and she moved forward with the resilience that children have when they are given enough stability to do so. Marcus remained in her life consistently after the divorce. He attended her soccer games and her school events and her birthday parties, and the quality of his relationship with her did not appear to diminish in ways that affected her visibly. I was genuinely grateful for that. Whatever my feelings were about what he had done to our marriage, I did not want Sophie to lose her father, and she did not. That was the one thing we managed to do correctly in the aftermath of everything, and I want to say clearly that it mattered more than almost anything else. I returned to the classroom this September after the divorce was finalized, and I stood in front of 32 10th graders on the first day of school and talked to them about what it means to read a story carefully. I talked about how the most important information in any narrative is often not the thing being said directly but the thing being withheld. I talked about gaps and silences and the space between what a character tells us and what the evidence suggests is actually true. Several students took notes. One student in the back row raised her hand and asked me how you know when you are reading too much into something versus when you are actually seeing something real. I told her that was one of the best questions anyone had ever asked me in 16 years of teaching. I told her the honest answer was that you learn to trust your own reading over time. That you get better at it the more carefully you practice. That the only way to stop missing things is to commit to actually looking at them even when looking is uncomfortable. She wrote that down. I hope she keeps it. I have been asked by people who know my story whether I regret the 12 years. Whether I wish I had looked more carefully sooner. Whether the marriage was a waste. I understand why people ask these questions, and I do not think they are wrong questions. But my answer to all of them is the same. The 12 years produced Sophie, who is the best thing I have ever done. They produced a career I built steadily regardless of what was happening in my personal life. They produced friendships like the one with Renata that turned out to be essential when I needed them most. And they produced a version of me that is significantly clearer about what she deserves and significantly less willing to accept a surface explanation when the deeper story does not add up. I would not trade any of those things. Not even to have avoided the pain of finding out what I found out. Because the finding out was part of becoming someone who knows how to look. What I want to say to you at the end of this story is something simple. Financial trust in a marriage is a form of intimacy, and it deserves the same attention and honesty as every other form of intimacy. You do not have to be an accountant or a financial expert to ask questions about where your shared money goes. You are allowed to look. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to understand the full picture of the life you are building with another person. That is not distrust. That is partnership. Real partnership does not require one person to remain uninformed in order to function. My name is Caroline Marsh. I have been a teacher for 16 years. I spent 12 years inside a story I never thought to read carefully enough. When I finally did, I found the truth exactly where it had always been, waiting patiently for someone to look directly at it. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me your story, because I know I am not the only one who trusted someone complete.